Well, it's good to have you here this morning, Bethany. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me invite you to take out your message guide. It was provided for you in the program this morning. We are continuing in our series on the parables, so we want to encourage you to follow along with us as we spend these moments together. We're going to be looking in Luke chapter 18 this morning, Luke chapter 18. So if you have a Bible with you, you can turn there, or you can use your phone or your tablet, whatever you may be using. Or if you like to use a Bible that's available for you there in the seat, it's page 928. But we do encourage you to follow along in God's Word with us today as we look at it. You know, attitude, or our attitudes, they really affect our life in a big way. The attitude with which you approach a particular problem or any kind of situation doesn't necessarily need to be bad. It can be good. The attitude with which you approach something really can be a make or break issue. Sometimes when we speak with people or we interact, we end up, and we kind of, if you would, we portray an attitude. Have you ever had that happen, and perhaps not so much to you, but all of a sudden you are speaking with someone and just an attitude comes off. And it's like, ooh. And things kind of go south from there. Things come off the rail from there. And it ends up being not a good thing. If you don't think that attitude plays a difference in how things go, when you go home from church today, you can just ask some questions maybe of people in your family, like, hey, where are the clean clothes? Or sometimes I find myself, I'll be sitting there and I'll be watching something on the television or whatever, and my daughter has done this on occasion also. I don't mean to throw her under the bus. I actually learned it from her. But I'll say something like, oh, I thirst. I thirst. Or I hunger. I hunger. And what do I get? I get the side eye, or well, you know where the refrigerator is, or you know where the jug is. Have you ever been pulled over by a police officer? I mean, not because I was doing bad, but actually, I guess I was doing something bad. I got pulled over one time when we had moved to Maine. I didn't realize, I looked at the cars in Maine and I said, gosh, these are some of the most jalopnik, junky cars I've ever seen in my life up here. I said, there's no way in the world that they could be inspecting cars and let these derelicts drive on the road. So I lived in Maine for 3 years before I ever got my car inspected. And the reason I got my car inspected was because we were on our way to the church picnic and I got pulled over with some of the senior citizens in my back seat. But sometimes we get pulled over. We may be speeding. There may be something going on. We're not being careful. There's something happening, and we get pulled over. The police officer comes to the door. Here's an attitude you don't want to do. Do you have any idea how fast you were going? Well, do you have any idea how much of a hurry I'm in? That attitude isn't going to play well. You're sure to get a ticket. You may be even asked to step out of your car if you say something like that. So do you see how it works? Attitude really does help us move forward. It also holds us back. It creates situation. Attitude makes a difference. And so I want to set up today the parable we're going to look at, because if you would, there's a fair bit of attitude in this parable displayed by the primary characters that we're going to look at. Jesus is here with the Pharisees and his disciples. And as usual, they're trying to milk Jesus for some information about him or from him. The Pharisees often looking to trip him up because of something that he would say that would be inappropriate, or something that they would think would be incorrect spiritually from their perspective. We know that the Pharisees, the religious individuals of the day, they were really proud of their position. They were really proud of their prestige, and they would flaunt it before others. And so here, talking with these individuals, Jesus puts himself in a situation where he's able to tell another story. And so Luke kind of gives a spoiler. He tells us who this is for. Sometimes we don't know specifically who the parable is for. We just know that Jesus is teaching a spiritual truth, and I wonder, like in this particular, are you talking to me? Have you ever had like a conversation going on, or you were in a group and then all of a sudden it was like, whoa, are you talking to me? Is this about me? This is one of those kinds of parables, one of those kinds of situations. He is intending this for those who trust in themselves, for those that have their own righteousness, for those who are, if you would, living high on their own pride. These are individuals who are struggling with their attitude. Now, I've provided the entire passage there for you. We're going to read through it quickly. It's Luke 18. This is verses 9 to 14, this particular story, this particular teaching of Jesus. Let's take a look. It says, "Also he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous, and they despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess.' And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, a sinner.' I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." So in our mind's eye, as we look at this story today, we have the disciples and the Pharisees, and Jesus begins to teach and speaks to them, but it kind of has a spoiler. When someone says things like this, we tend to look at other people, don't we? You know, when we're talking about somebody being prideful, we tend to what? We turn to somebody else, or someone who's got a bad attitude, we look at someone else. Most of us would say something like, "Boy, I'm glad he's not talking about me." None of us think that. We don't think, "Oh, this is so me. He's obviously talking about me." We think about today, if I was to put it in our context, we think about the fact that we go to church. We think about the fact that we give. We may think about the fact that we serve in some way. We think about the fact perhaps that we spend moments in prayer. Perhaps we go to a next step group. Perhaps we volunteer in some aspect through the church. We participate in the CAC and in that particular connection with our community. So Jesus begins, and we have these 2 people going to the temple here to pray. The temple literally is about is above everything else. It is higher. It is literally, in the scheme of the city, it is higher. To go up and to be there, in some sense, even though it was so important, was really no big deal because people went there on a regular basis. People did this every day. And he points out that 2 individuals, one a Pharisee and one a tax collector, go there on the same day. They do the same thing, but they do it with completely different attitudes. They do it with different attitudes. And so he introduces them to us, this tax collector and this Pharisee. Now, every great story has a hero and a villain, right? You know, you want to, you know, and sometimes I guess some of the better ones make it hard for you to figure out who the villain is until a little bit later on. It's like, oh, it could be this person, or maybe they did it. No, he did it. Oh, she did it. And we figure that out. And so here's a story, and we're looking for the hero and the villain. in this particular case. So Jesus introduces this, and I think there would have been a cheer for the Pharisee, and there would have been a jeer for the tax collector. Jesus talks about how they prayed. And it's interesting because he gives us a perspective on how our prayers sound to him. We get a perspective on how we sound. Have you ever wondered, I wonder how I sound to God when I pray? Well, this kind of gives you a little idea, a little moment in those shoes. And it was a tough moment. Perhaps it was a tough moment for a disciple like Matthew. Because Matthew, if you know anything about him, he used to be a tax collector. And so you have Matthew. This is a very personal moment for him. This is close to his heart. So the Pharisee takes his place where everyone can hear and see him, where he can be celebrated down front. And in verse 11 of the verses that we read, it says this: the Pharisee stood and he prayed thus with himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners and unjust, adulterers, or even this tax collector. Some translations, and you may have a different translation with you this morning, what I'm reading from is the New King James Version, but some of them translate this that he prayed about himself, or he prayed to himself. Thank God that I'm not like those people, greedy people, unrighteous adulterers, sinful, dirty people. And so if he wasn't pointing fingers up to now, he does and says, even like that tax collector. It was not bad that he was not those things. Let me just say, it was not a bad thing that he wasn't an extortioner. It was not a bad thing that he was not unjust. It was not a bad thing that he had not committed adultery. But what was bad was the pride of not being those things, the attitude with which he approached things. Sometimes we can be pride of our don't lists. We talk about, these are the things I do. In this particular case, the Pharisee is proud of the things he don't. And we can be proud of our don't list. I don't do these things like this person. I don't do these things like those people. I don't do these things like that. And he wears those as a badge. I'm not like those people. But then he goes further and he says this. He says, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Now, let's just be thinking about this. This is a pretty serious commitment. I mean, how many of us would be able to say those things about ourselves, even today? That you twice a week abstain from food in order that you might focus on your spiritual relationship. Now, when it comes to the resources that God entrusts to you, you give a tenth of all of those things back to the work of the Lord, back to his storehouse. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. And so these aren't bad things. But in some sense, and we've used this term before, it's kind of a cultural term, it dropped the mic. This is a drop the mic moment for this Pharisee. I don't do these things. I don't do these things. I don't do that. I don't do this. I do tithe. I do fast. Boom. And he drops the mic. And I would venture to say that the people who were there, the religious leaders, if you would, they're like, yeah, amen. Good job. Awesome. You the man. You're on top. That's what I kind of perceive to be going on here. Have you ever been in prayer meeting, or you've been in a situation, or perhaps you've been in a conversation, or you're in a situation where people are sharing their testimonies, and somebody shares something, or somebody prays, or whatever, and then all of a sudden it's like, poof, and you're like, I got nothing. What am I supposed to say after that? Sometimes when people come, and they're like the second speaker or they're the last speaker, they're like, what am I supposed to say at this point? It's all been said. Let's pray. And that's it. Let's go home. What, at this point, what is anyone supposed to say? He calls out this tax collector here. He's hanging out in the back. He doesn't even feel worthy of moving forward, much less the idea of being on the front row. His head is low. He's beating his chest. He's living in shame of what he did. And we contrast the Pharisee and his attitude and his situation with that of the tax collector. It says the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, let me tell you, we're kind of in this context of prayer here. The Pharisee is praying, the tax collector is praying. And so in this particular context of prayer, we can focus on the idea of our attitude being important as we pray. But in a macro way, our attitude as we approach whatever our spiritual endeavor is very important. The heart with which we approach what God has us doing, or the way he has us serving, or what we're working through, those are important. And so his prayer is incredibly powerful. It's only 7 words, but it's what? God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, there are different things here that we can pick up and pick out about this tax collector's prayer that are certainly different from what the Pharisee laid out. The first is this: the tax collector had an attitude of what? Of humility. We see his posture. He's in the back. His head is low. He beats his chest. He doesn't get verbose in his prayer. He doesn't use, if you would, fancy words or voluminous amounts of words. And, it's very simple. It's a short prayer. He identifies himself as a sinner, as a lawbreaker, as someone who's out of step with God's will for his life. The Pharisee, in comparison here with regard to this attitude, he refers to himself 5 times. He's speaking about himself, and his prayer is relatively long in comparison. But the tax collector, he only refers to himself once. And what does he say? He says, I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. There was an attitude of humility. Let me suggest, secondly, that the tax collector admitted his need. In the midst of his praying and where his heart was, he realized that he needed God. He needed something that within himself he couldn't provide, that he couldn't take care of. One of the things that's true, and I think this is a spiritual truth in general, is that no one comes to God without experiencing their need. That if you're here in this room and you know Jesus is your Savior, there is a sense that you can reflect back on, or a moment that you can understand, I need God. I need a relationship with Jesus. I know I can't do this on my own. I've been trying and I just can't seem to get anywhere. No traction. And so here, this tax collector, he realizes in the humility of this moment, he realizes his need for God to be merciful to him, for God to be gracious to him. If you're here today and you've been struggling and perhaps you're just going through it, this is a word for you. And it doesn't need to be a lot of words from you. It can be as simple as the realization that a humble heart brings, that you need God to be merciful to you as a sinner, as someone who's out of step with him. Years ago, I had to wake up to that fact myself. There are people in this room who had to acknowledge that fact themselves. And let me tell you, that acknowledgement makes all the difference. It's all the difference. So he has this attitude of humility. He admits his need, and what does he do? We could say this: he asks for help. Asks for help. He made a request. The one thing the Pharisee didn't do in his prayer is the one thing that he really needed. And that was what? To ask for help. To say, Lord, have mercy. Lord, help me. When Jesus finishes putting these two gentlemen on display here, he continues on speaking to those that were listening there. And few would have caught the issue to this point, I think. Few would have not caught on to exactly what was being said. And so the Pharisee drops the mic, the tax collector drops the mic, everything's done. And they would have said, yeah, this guy really does need mercy. He should be praying. He really does need mercy. And that's when Jesus steps up and he says this. He says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. I imagine you could have heard a pin drop. What? Wait, what did he say? Did you hear how good the Pharisee was? How he followed all the rules? And then this dirty robber of our people, who we hate, he's the one who goes home justified? I think there probably in that moment was a little confusion in that group. They couldn't understand why Jesus would say this. And he gives the reason in the second part of this verse. He says, the reason this is true is because everyone who exalts himself is going to be humbled. And he who humbles himself will be exalted. One of the truths that I think this kind of draws out for us is the idea that none of us are ever going to be good enough. The tax collector realized he would never be good enough to have a relationship with God. He would never be good enough to be able to stand before God. But that the Pharisee thought he could put together enough good things in order to be able to stand before him, our God, and everything would be okay. You see, the problem is, and this is just a recognition, none of us is perfect. None of us has it all together. None of us hasn't tripped up and stumbled spiritually. In fact, Scripture makes it clear that we are actually born in sin. No one had to teach the little baby to wig out when they're hungry. No one had to teach that child in the cart as you go through the supermarket checkout to go nuts when they can't have all of those tasty things that are there. No one had to teach them that. And so it is that we're not good enough. Never will be. And no matter how good we might get, we're never going to be that good. To have all the good, to have all the rights, to do all of the rights and never do all of the don't, never stay away from all the don'ts. That's why in Ephesians 2, Paul, he shares it this way. He says, you're saved by grace, this not of yourselves. It's a gift of God. What? Not of works. Why? Because we can never do enough of those good works, lest any of us would boast. It's all about him. It's about his mercy. It's about his grace. It's about what he does for us. Our works are worthless in relation to our salvation. Our works are worthless with regard to the status that we have with God. Our works don't elevate us. If you would, and maybe this is the way I would put it, our works and the good things that we do are on the backside of the equation. They're on the backside. They're the fruit of what God has done in our life. Before we come to know Christ, even the good things that we do are tainted by an attitude of selfishness and getting me ahead. That's why our transforming truth for today is this: spiritual works are not the root, but they are the result of our salvation. So all of those wonderful things that the Pharisee did and that he was holding on to and offered up in prayer with his kind of crooked heart, valueless. But the simple prayer of the humble, broken tax collector who was a sinner and realized it, who called on God for mercy, yes. Yes. Spiritual works, they're not the root. They're the fruit of what God does in our life. So what is Jesus doing here? And I want to close with this. I think Jesus is doing some important, if you would, shifting for the religious leaders and the people of his day. He's shifting their mindset. He's adjusting their attitude. He's taking their heart and he's beginning to turn their heart and point it in a much more biblical, a much more appropriate, a much more God-honoring direction. We see this over in Philippians chapter 2. And I want to suggest two things here that Jesus is accomplishing. The first thing is this, is that I believe Jesus flips what I'm going to call the paradigm. Jesus is flipping the paradigm. He's flipping it. He's saying, if you want to get ahead in life and accomplish something, be exalted. When you want to get ahead, you have to smack other people down. You have to bring them low because you know what? The way to get ahead is to climb up on the bodies of those that you've taken out. Right? That's how we get ahead. This is how the world looks back. Those that have made it, they look back at the refuse and the destruction of the people that they've left behind them. Instead, what he does is he humbles himself. Jesus says, and you will be exalted. The way to get ahead is not to smack down or to put yourself in front, but he says, rather, he says, the way to be exalted is to humble yourself. And so he changes the paradigm and he sets the pace. He says, let me give you another idea, and this is what it looks like. This is how it works. This is the fleshing out of it. In Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, down through verse 11, Paul sets this up in a Christian living context. He takes this parable and the illustration of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and he gives it some practical outworking for you and me about our attitude and our heart and how we approach things and how we enter into a relationship with him. This is what it says. It says, therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, if there is any comfort in love, any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, one mind. And here is where he gets strong. He lays it out. He says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit. Perhaps your version says vain conceit. But in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. Let this mind be in you, which was in Christ Jesus. Another way to say this is to have the same attitude. Have the same attitude as Jesus. We're talking about the importance of attitude. When it comes to living and being what God wants us to be, he's saying attitude matters. You need to have the same attitude that Jesus had, the same approach life with the same paradigm, that same idea, that same structure. Because attitude is everything and humility changes everything. It changes the outcome. And he says, have it like Jesus. Paul, what do you mean? What do you mean like Jesus? What are you saying here? I don't understand. What about Jesus? Jesus, being in the form of God, he did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. But he made himself of no reputation. He took the form of a bondservant, coming in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Therefore, God also highly exalted him, has given him the name which is above every name. At the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, of those in heaven, of those on earth, of those under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's our example. That's the attitude we need to have. It's the attitude of Jesus that did not lift himself up, but also considered the issues and the needs and the care and the concerns of others, the brokenness of their relationship with his heavenly Father, which sent him to the cross. So Jesus sets the pace for us when it comes to this new paradigm. He is the picture of it. He says, humble yourselves and you will be exalted. And he says, let me show you how it works. He steps out of heaven. He becomes human. He lives as a servant. He didn't have privileges of heaven. But ultimately, he goes and he offers himself up. He dies the death of the cross that no one except the very worst of individuals would ever deserve. He held nothing back for us. That's the picture. C.S. Lewis had a great quote with regard to the issue of humility, and it's this. It's that humility is not thinking less of yourself, rather it is thinking of yourself less. I like that. Humility is not when I think of myself, is not when I think, less of myself, like, I already, if I'm real with myself, I already know I'm miserable when it comes to living for the Lord and stuff like that. I got so much yet to do. Not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. So don't beat yourself up. It's just not about you. It's about him. James 4:6. James says this, he gives more grace. He gives us more grace. Therefore, he says, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So when we're proud like the Pharisee that Jesus shows us, this pride puts a wedge between us and God. It keeps us from being connected with him and moving forward. However, in humility, we receive grace, and it strengthens our relationship with him. Peter talks about this issue of humility in his particular context. I gave you the first part of this verse here, but the important part I want to focus on here is in this relationship of younger people and their relationship with elders and those that might be over them in submission to them. He says this, all of you be submissive to one another and what? Be clothed with humility. Because why? God resists the proud and he gives grace to the humble. I don't know about you this morning, but I can use all the mercy and grace that I can get. I can, because I need it. I need it. I need all of this mercy and grace, this love of God that I can get. So what would it look like for you and for me this week to clothe ourselves in humility? To take upon ourselves the attitude, the heart of the tax collector who recognized that he was a sinner, that he was broken. How would this change, this attitude of humility? How would it change your prayer life? If you were to take a step back and kind of say, wow, I wonder how what I pray sounds to God or perhaps someone who hears me. How would humility affect my day at school, my day at work? How would it affect my relationship at home? How would a little bit of humility affect your marriage? how would things be different? I wonder if this week you would respond and say, Lord, help me. God, help me. I'm a sinner. I need your mercy. I need your grace. I want to be obedient to you. I want to follow the pace that Jesus set, who didn't consider equality with God something that he had to hold on to, but rather took upon himself the role of a servant and was willing to give up it all, give it all up, so that I might come to know you. And so, Lord, help me to give it up. Help me to be humble. Help me to not hold on to those things, but rather to let them go. God, this week, would you take my life? Help me to live more for you. That's our closing thought this morning. God, take my life. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. It's a beautiful hymn. It's a wonderful expression of our desire to have that right attitude and to follow him each and every day of this coming week. Let me invite the worship team to come back up. We're going to close with that song this morning.